This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Monday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. One of my goals with this series is ultimately to have done a top 10 on every single set, and today we're continuing with that by looking at a few pretty unique ones, the Portal sets. Portal was released in 1997, and it was intended as a beginner product for Magic the Gathering. The set was highly simplified, to the point that it didn't even feature any artifact, enchantments, or instants. There were only creatures and sorceries and lands. And some of the cards use different terminology than we're used to. For example, intercept instead of block. Portal was also designed to be a game sort of separate from Magic that was an introduction to it. The first Portal set was followed by two more, Portal Second Age in 1998 and Portal Three Kingdoms in 1999. These sets were not originally legal in competitive Magic, but many cards originally printed in the set were later reprinted in standard releases, and then in 2005, Wizards decided to make all these cards legal in Legacy and Vintage. I was prompted to do this list in particular because of a conversation I had with someone in the comments on another video. A few weeks ago, I did a top 10 on the game's worst dragons, and a viewer commented that it didn't seem fair to include cards from Three Kingdoms on the list since it was an intentionally powered down set, and the comment isn't incorrect. These sets are underpowered since they're intentionally simplified, but I had a feeling that on the whole, Portal sets probably aren't that much weaker than some of the worst sets out there that I've already done MTG Top 10s on, like Fallen Empires. So, to be eligible for this video, a card had to receive its first printing in one of the three Portal sets. Cards that were reprints in these three sets don't count. In all, there were 416 cards eligible, and in this video, we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first-tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours and Set Championships. And a second-tier top 8 is worth 1 point, and that includes things like Grand Prix and Magic Fests. At number 10, it's Volcanic Hammer. It was originally printed in Portal before being reprinted in 7th, 8th, and 9th edition, and we're going to see a fair bit of that, cards from Portal being reprinted in core sets. That makes sense because core sets are also intentionally simplified sets. Anyway, 2 mana to do 3 to any target is almost always a card that's going to see at least some play. It's a very reasonable rate, allowing players to efficiently get creatures out of the way, while also potentially helping you do lethal to your opponent. Once Volcanic Hammer was reprinted in standard legal core sets, it gained points in standard and extended burn and aggro decks. It doesn't have any points since 2006, but it's definitely the kind of card that if they ever just decide to reprint it, it's likely to gain some more points. At number 9, I have Exhaustion. It has the same total points as Volcanic Hammer, but more Pro Tour top 8, so it got the higher slot. This card is probably more well known for being printed in Urza's Saga in 1998, but before that it was printed in both Portal and Portal Second Age. This card has a pretty powerful effect in the right situation, since it makes your opponent skip their untap step. This obviously only really matters if your opponent has stuff that's tapped, but because that tends to happen in Magic on most turns anyway, this can be a pretty nice effect that sort of feels like you're casting Time Walk. In Urza's Block Constructed, Exhaustion was featured in a blue-red control deck that top-8'd the Block Pro Tour, and that was it for points it gained as a result of its Urza's Saga printing. However, it got reprinted later on in 9th edition, giving it legality in Standard, and it found some more points as a result. And it did it in one of the wackier decks we've ever seen at a Pro Tour. It was played in 2 decks that top-8'd Pro Tour Honolulu in 2006, both of which were Owling Mine decks. This deck used a bunch of bounce and symmetrical card draw to make the opponent have a whole bunch of cards in hand so that Ebony Owl Netsuke would damage them, and Exhaustion was great in the deck, since casting it often meant your opponent couldn't do much more than play 1 land on their turn, and their hand would still have a bunch of cards in it. After that, Exhaustion went dormant for a long time before re-emerging in modern Walks decks. These decks are similar to the more well-known Taking Turns decks that are making the rounds in competitive Magic these days, in that they sought to cast a bunch of Time Walks in a row until they won. And again, while Exhaustion is not quite a Time Walk, it could sort of feel like one in the deck. It doesn't have any points since 2019, but it stands a decent chance at gaining more points in the future. At number 8, it's WILDFIRE, which is actually one of my favorite cards ever. Yeah, I played a land destruction deck back in the day. I was that guy. Anyway, this has the same total points as both Exhaustion and Volcanic Hammer, but has the most Pro Tour top 8s of the three, so it gets to be number 8. It was originally printed in Portal 2nd Age before being printed in Urza Saga, 7th edition, and 9th edition. So, yeah, it does 4 to all creatures and makes both players sacrifice 4 lands. While that effect is symmetrical, the decks that played Wildfire were obviously built around the idea of minimizing the damage it could do to them. This usually involved playing mana rocks and win condition creatures with more than 4 toughness. Wildfire decks found success in Urza's Block Constructed and Standard. It gained all of those points in 1999, and it isn't super well positioned right now to gain more points in the future. At number 7, it's Mind Rot. That's right, one of the most reprinted cards ever actually made its debut in Portal. For 3 mana, this makes your opponent discard 2 cards. That's a pretty nice disruptive effect against some decks, and one that will net you a 2-for-1. Mind Rot has received 25 printings in total, but the only time where it really showed up in competitive Magic was from 2009 to 2010, when it was played in standard Jund decks. A big part of that deck's game plan was generating 2-for-1s, and while it ran the much better Blightning in the main deck, Mind Rot was a card that could come in against opponents who were particularly vulnerable to discard effects. It doesn't have any points since 2010, and it isn't super likely to gain more points in the future, even with a standard legal reprint. We've seen several of them recently, and it hasn't really mattered. At number 6, it's Wood Elves. This is another card that made its debut in the first Portal set, and then was later printed in standard legal sets, including Exodus, 7th, 8th, and 9th edition. 3 mana for a 1/1 is not a good rate, but this lets you search up a forest and put it on the battlefield, giving you some very real ramp. And importantly, it doesn't say basic forest, so you can grab any land with the forest type. In Ravnica Standard, it gained points in ramp decks as well as green-white aggro decks, and in Modern, it's been played in Scapeshift decks, which at their core are really just combo-oriented ramp decks. It hasn't gained any points since 2019, but it has seen enough play in Modern that it's hard to count it out entirely. At number 5, it's Imperial Seal. This is the first card on the list that didn't ever gain legality in Standard, since it was never reprinted in a standard release set, or never reprinted at all. That's part of the reason it has such a high price. Instead, it had to wait until 2005 when all the cards from Portal became legal in the Eternal formats. This one is from Portal 3 Kingdoms, which is unique even among the Portal sets because it was released with the plan of introducing the Asian market to Magic. So it was effectively a self-contained version of Magic that made use of real Chinese historical figures and events from the Three Kingdoms period. That's where this set gets its name, Portal 3 Kingdoms. Anyway, Imperial Seal is a 1-mana tutor, and those tend to fare pretty well. It does only put the card on top of your library and only at sorcery speed, which makes it a little less impressive, but searching up your most needed card is often worth it in the right deck. It's a sorcery speed version of Vampiric Tutor, and getting some additional copies of that card is pretty nice. Imperial Seal couldn't catch a break though. It had to wait until 2005 to become legal in the Eternal formats, and then it was pretty much immediately banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage. Those two formats just had too many powerful cards and combo decks, and being able to tutor stuff up consistently is too good. But as a result, the Seal has only gained points in Vintage, where several decks run the single copy they're allowed, mostly combo decks like Storm, Oath of Druids, and Dark Depths. It will continue gaining points in the format, though not at a very fast rate. There just aren't enough Vintage events, and it's only used by a few decks in the format. At number 4, it's Imperial Recruiter. Like Imperial Seal, this is a Portal 3 Kingdoms card that didn't ever receive a standard legal reprint. Also, like the Seal, the Recruiter is a tutor, one that lets you search up any creature from your deck with 2 or less power and put it directly in your hand. The Recruiter is great in creature-based combo decks, but it's particularly spicy in Toolbox or Hate Bear decks that run singleton copies of creatures that are only really great in specific situations, and searching them up in those situations is really powerful. Unlike the Seal, it was legal in Legacy, where it gained points in Painter's Servant combo decks since it could search up the eponymous creature, and it has also gained points in Alurin and Death and Taxes. Some good news for the Recruiter came earlier this year too, since it received a reprint in Modern Horizons 2, which means now it's legal in Modern. It's already cashed in on that fact, gaining points in Hate Bear and human decks in the format. It's going to continue gaining points in both Legacy and Modern going forward. At number 3, it's Goblin Matron, our third consecutive tutor. This one lets you search up a goblin from your deck and put it into your hand. Obviously, that plays really well in goblin decks, which will have a whole lot of nice options to search up. This especially includes powerful goblin payoffs that can drastically alter the board state. The Matron was originally printed in Portal 2nd Age, and then received reprints in Urza's Saga and 7th edition. The Matron never received any points in Standard, she just wasn't printed at a Goblin-heavy time. However, by 2004, Goblins were a pretty big deal in multiple formats as a result of the release of Onslaught Block, and that's when the Matron started to do some work in the newly spawned Goblin decks that appeared in Extended and Legacy. She could now search things up like Goblin Warchief and Siege Gang Commander, which is pretty impressive. Then she received two pretty important reprints in 2019 and 2020. First, she was reprinted in Modern Horizons, giving her legality in Modern for the first time, and then she was printed in Magic Arena's Historic Anthology 1, making her legal in Historic. She has especially cashed in Historic, where Goblin decks dominated for much of 2020. The deck's big game plan was to play a bunch of Goblins ahead of Muxus Goblin Grandee, and obviously the Matron could help with that plan by both adding a Goblin body to the board and tutoring up the powerful and usually game-winning Grandee. The Matron is likely to continue to gain points in both Historic and Modern going forward, and there's even an outside shot she could do more in Legacy. At number 2, it's Strategic Planning, which is another Portal 3 Kingdoms card. For 2 mana, this gives you some nice selection while also loading up your graveyard. Strategic Planning received its first Standard legal reprint much more recently than the other cards on the set did. It got its reprints in Hour of Devastation and then Kaldheim, so for a long time it was only legal in the Eternal formats. And this card isn't exactly a powerhouse, and as you can imagine, it didn't see a ton of play during that time, though it did gain some points in Legacy Show and Tell. The rest of its points have come quite recently, as a result of the aforementioned reprints. During Amonkhet Standard, it was featured in graveyard decks, most notably God Pharaoh's Gift, since it could help you find the powerful artifact while also putting stuff in the graveyard to fuel it in the first place. In Kaldheim Standard, it has gained points in Sultai control decks, which also have a graveyard sub-theme. Because Planning was printed in those two sets, it's also legal in Historic and Pioneer, and it's gained plenty of points in those formats too. In both of them, it's found success in Arclight Phoenix decks, a deck that loves spells and putting things in the graveyard, so it's a pretty natural fit. In Pioneer, it has also gained points in now banned out of the format decks like Dimir Inverter and Lotus Field, both of which were combo decks that needed a well-stocked graveyard. Strategic Planning looks like it will gain more points in the future, but it is unlikely it will ever catch the number 1 card on this list, which is Sleight of Hand. It received its first printing in Portal 2nd Age before also receiving Standard legal reprints in both 7th and 9th edition. It isn't exactly an exciting card, but it is a nice little cantrip for control decks and or decks with lots of spell payoffs. For 1 mana, you get to choose one of the top cards of your library and put it in your hand, and the other on the bottom of your library. Seeing 2 cards and getting the best one for 1 mana is a nice deal. It was played in Standard each time it was legal there, first in Opposition decks, then in Enduring Ideal and Owling Mine, and then in Dragonstorm. Storm decks, like Dragonstorm, would go on to feature Sleight of Hand in other formats too, like Extended and Modern. Modern has been the format where Sleight of Hand has been the most prolific by far. This is because 2 other 1-mana cantrips that are better are banned, in particular Preordain and Ponder. As a result, if a blue deck is looking for a cantrip, it's pretty much going to have to turn to Sleight of Hand, though this has changed a little bit since the Standard legal reprint of Opt. So it doesn't really have very many points in Legacy, because in that format you can run things like Preordain and Ponder, not to mention Brainstorm. But yeah, Sleight of Hand is going to continue to gain points in Modern going forward, and it already has a massive lead atop this list. It seems unlikely any other card will ever pass it. So those are the 10 cards from the Portal sets that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. I think if you go and watch the top 10s on sets like Fallen Empires and Homelands, you'll find that this list compares pretty favorably with them in terms of how good the cards are in it. Now, to be fair, there are a lot more cards that were considered for this video overall, so maybe it is a little bit weaker, but I do think it's a set we can look at just like we look at other core sets. Sure, it's intentionally simplified and powered down, but there's still plenty of cards in it that have made an impact in competitive Magic, as this video showed. If you want to own any of these cards from Portal, or Portal 2nd Age, or Portal 3 Kingdom, you can find a link in the description for every single card that appeared in the video that will take you directly to the Card Kingdom store for that specific card. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more on other sets, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.